So my name is Tom Fletcher. I'm the principal of Hertford College, and my job is to give you a very warm, enthusiastic welcome to Oxford University and to the Sheldonian Theatre today for this amazing session that we have ahead of us with an extraordinary panel and two extraordinary speakers. One of the great advantages of being an Oxford head of house is that people always give you lots of books. But one of the great disadvantages is that you never have any time to read them. And so when someone tells you about a book and then tells you about it again and tells you about it again, you find that time to read it. And I think that the great books are the ones that make you think, but the greatest books are the ones that make you act. The great books are the ones you want to give to one person. The greatest books are the ones you want to shout about to the whole world. And we're discussing two books today which are calls to action. And this gathering today, the first gathering of the Oxford Ministry for the Future, of which you are all now members, is our response to that call to action. How do we make our work, how do we make our teaching, how do we make our research more urgent, more activist, and more brave? That's the challenge that's been set for us and which we'll be discussing today. So a huge welcome. I'm going to hand over now to the person who has curated, led, driven this work so far and has really put the hard work in to make this event as special as it will be. Professor Annette Mikes from Hertford College and from Side Business School. Please take it from here. Annette.
Welcome, everyone. I'm as pleased as Tom, as pleased as the big smiles that I see around me to welcome you at the Sheldonian Library. 2 years ago, we had an event with just a handful of us in the Western Library. That was just after Kim Stanley Robinson's book, the Ministry for the Future, was published. I took the temerity to invite Stan to Oxford and organized a panel of interdisciplinary academics to discuss this book because I felt it was important, it has to be heard, it's got important messages that we as researchers, scholars, and students should listen to. Stan didn't accept the invitation to fly over. He couldn't, but we beamed him in from California online. That was a hybrid event. And we had on the stage 5 humanities and other academics discussing the book. That event was a great success, and we decided to stay with the theme. Over the last 2 years, more and more people started to pick up the conversation, and here we are again, asking the question, why is it that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of this form of capitalism? There is an answer that's emerging to that. That we can actually break the hold of capitalist realism. We can extend our moral imagination to imagine a better way of being and to imagine practical solutions to drive towards that better way of being. So the conversation continues, and we were very lucky when Stan contacted us and said, I could be in person in Oxford in 2024 June. So we decided to convene this event. We also decided to make it a little bit more broad and inclusive and ask Stan to enter into conversation with other important voices that need to be heard and maybe don't get heard as much as they should. So the selection of speakers that we have today all come from the humanities. The humanities' voices are a little bit less heard in climate action and policy than we think they should be heard. We paired Stan up with the wonderful Kate Raworth, author of Doughnut Economics, who is going to lead the conversation with her talk. Then Stan follows, and then we're going to invite a panel of academics onto this stage to enter into conversation with Stan and Kate and each other. So I'm going to step off now, and I'm going to invite Kate to come to the stage. Kate is author of Doughnut Economics and leader of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, is going to talk to us what happened since the publication of Doughnut Economics in 2017 and how the Doughnut is coming to life and into action in practice. So please. You're going to have to.
Thank you, Annette. By the way, brilliant academic who makes things happen. Can we have a round of applause for Annette, because she's made this happen? This is a bit posh, isn't it? I mean, I know Kim Stanley Robinson's in town, so Oxford flings open the doors of its best buildings, but suddenly we're in posh space. Let's make sure that that doesn't make us posh and well-behaved and only say proper things. Did you know that this building was actually built because until this point, all of the university's meetings were held in St. Mary's Church, and they thought it was not proper to have rowdy meetings in the church, and so this was built for the rowdy meetings. We have something, an obligation here to blow the roof off and cause a ruckus. And if you look up, the roof's already been blown off. It's open to the sky. So let's use this building like what it was made for. So I'm thrilled to be here together with Stan today. I'm an economist, he's a novelist, but we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about works of fiction. Because economics is, of course, a great work of fiction. I have, in fact, here the greatest work of 20th century fiction. Let me click through there. Economics by Paul Samuelson. Just put up your hand if you've ever studied economics at school, at university. Oh, yeah, oh, there's a lot of us in the house. Welcome, team. Okay. So this is the most influential book of the 20th century, I'm going to argue, because Samuelson in 1948 laid down, this isn't called one particular type of economics, complexity, this is just economics. And did you notice your degree is just called economics? And this is what it is. If you think I'm being rude or insulting to Samuelson, he agrees with me. He said himself, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties, so long as I can write the economics textbooks. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. Yes, Paul Samuelson wanted to lick your blank mind, as if we ever had blank minds, because he knew that the first diagrams, the first words, the first concepts that we bring frame what we see and what we don't see, what we put at the center, what we leave invisible. And that shapes the entire economic story of who we think we are, where we think we are, how we think things work, what we think success looks like, and therefore what we should do. It's an incredibly powerful story of fiction. So many of us in this room have already studied economics, but many of us haven't. Don't worry, you haven't been left out. You are imbibed in that mindset every time you turn on the radio, every time you listen to a politician or a journalist or indeed an economist telling us about this election, about how the economy should grow or change. We are steeped in swimming in this economic water, so we've all been got by it. But let me sum up the 20th century economic mindset in one slide. 3 images. So let me just call on the economists in the house. What's the first image you remember learning? Supply and demand. Now, the fact that I can ask that question in lecture theatres the world over and the students will give the same answer tells me we're touching ideology. Name me one other subject where all the students the world over will tell you the same spontaneous answer to the first image. Supply and demand. Welcome to economics. It's all about the market. We put supply and demand with price as the metric of concern at the center of our vision. That's a very political move. It does not have to start there. Has huge consequences. What about who we are, the portrait of humanity? It's rational economic man. He doesn't get a picture in the books, but I know that pictures are powerful, so I drew him. He looks something like this, a man with no dependence. He's got ego in his heart, money in his hand, a calculator in his head. He's got nature at his feet. He hates work. He loves luxury. He knows the price of everything. He can never get enough. Those are the traits given to humanity in the economics equations. And the dangerous thing about them is that, and research by Robert Frank and others have shown that the more students learn of this character, the more they want to be like him. The more over the years of their study they value competition, not collaboration, self-interest, not altruism. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. We need a new model, a new picture of ourselves, not just in economics, in every academic discipline, because it's powerful. And then the final one, the goal. What's the goal? Well, it never gets drawn, but this powerful, powerful picture underlies every economic conversation. It's incredibly dominant in the UK conversation right now. It is, of course, growth, endlessly. Look at this line, shooting off the page, never having a question as to where it should ever stop. Growth measured in GDP, no matter how rich of a nation already is. We're in one of the richest countries in the history of humanity, but still, you can listen to both sides of the house here now. Apparently, the solution to all our problems here lies in growth, yet more growth without end. There's an absurdity in that. And what if somebody looked at these diagrams and said, pray tell me, where is the living world? Ah, says the economist, yes, if you want to talk about climate breakdown, ocean acidification, acid rain, the sixth mass extinction, chemical pollution, land degradation, air pollution. Yes, yes, we have a term for that. It's called an environmental externality. You see that little red wedge? There it is. There's everything that we're doing to kill the living world. It's there, it's in the diagrams, it's that little red wedge. It's taken care of. What about how we as humans relate to the living world? Well, we place ourselves at the top of this pyramid, nature as a resource, a Lego brick to be redesigned by us. This is how mainstream economics includes the living world in this story of this fiction. And I'm only half joking when I say that, you know, if aliens, let's go to science fiction for a minute, if aliens wanted to take down humanity, they don't need to land here with their lasers. They just need to convince us, dear humans, here's a neat way to depict Earth in your economic models. And they know that we will take care of the rest, as we are so well doing right now. So we need profoundly to change this fiction and create a new story, because it is storytelling. We need a new vision and a story with words and pictures that will give us half a chance of actually thriving on this planet. It was Kenneth Boulding in 1966 who wrote a classic essay. If you want to read it, it's short, it's sweet, it's brilliant. He said, we have inherited the cowboy economy. He says, I'm tempted to call the open economy of today the cowboy economy, the cowboy being symbolic of the illimitable plains and also associated with reckless, exploitative, romantic, and violent, and let's name it colonial behavior, which is characteristic of open societies. Cowboy economy ain't going to serve us. He said, I call for the closed economy of the future. It might be called the spaceman economy, in which Earth has become a single spaceship without unlimited reservoirs of anything, either for extraction or for pollution, in which, therefore, man must find his place in a cyclical ecological system which is capable of continuous reproduction. 1966, folks. Whoops, ooh, clicker's gone crazy. Clicker just malfunctioned. Okay. I won't be defeated by technology. Let's go backwards. Okay, 1968, the Earthrise. First time we ever saw Earth, this beautiful spaceship from space. It prompted Buckminster Fuller to write, we are not going to be able to operate our spaceship Earth successfully, nor for much longer, unless we see it as a whole spaceship and our fate as common. In 1970, Robert Heilbronner says, as in all spaceships, sustained life requires that a meticulous balance be maintained between the capability of the vehicle to support life and the demands made by the inhabitants of the craft. That's 1970. I was born at the end of 1970. So all this was seen and known before I and many of us here were even born. Does that make you weep? Would they have thought when they wrote this and said this and showed this picture that the children not yet born today, when they're 53, quarter of the way through the 21st century, still won't be in a world that got this? We'll still have to be standing on stages in posh buildings in Oxford trying to argue that we should see the world like this because it's still not happening. It's still not the way economics is taught in this university or any other major university that's celebrated around the world. Why are we being so slow? Herman Daly had a really good go at it in the 1970s. He said, look, and he's an economist, by the way, an ecological economist. He said, look, maybe there was a time when it was okay to say that the economy is small in relation to the ecosystem. Oh, we're little humans. We're only taking a bit of timber. We're only burning a bit of fossil fuel. It's only a bit of pollution. The sky's so high, the ocean's so vast. What could we possibly do to disrupt it? But Daly said, we ain't there anymore, folks. We're in full world. The economy is banging up against the edges of the biosphere, and that changes everything. That changes what you economize on. That changes what you think is scarce and what you value. So Herman Daly gave the world of economics a really good run at this in the 1970s. Did economics listen? No. No, the living world has been missing. No undergraduate in this university or others is taught the freaking obvious. The economy is a subset of the living world. Deal with it and everything that follows changes. It was only 40 years later, in 2009, the Earth system scientists come along. And when I first saw this diagram, I felt like the world's Earth system scientists, Johan Rockström, Will Steffen, Catherine Richardson, and many others around 30 said, I saw it's like they're saying, okay, economists, if you still won't recognize the economy as a subset of the living world, you know what? We're just going to take that out of your hands. We're going to do it for you. Here it is, actually. Here's one we made earlier. So the green circle is a space operating space safe for humanity. We've got to stay within that green circle. These are the 9 planetary boundaries, the life-supporting systems that make life work on this unique and delicately balanced living planet. And guess what? We've already overshot 3 of them. Spoiler alert, it's not 2009 anymore, it's 2024. We've now overshot 6 of them. We are way out of that safe operating space. So when I first saw this, when it was published, I was working at Oxfam on social justice, and I thought, if we're overshooting the outer limits of thriving, we are also massively falling short on the inner limits, the human rights, the claim of every person to the resources they need for decent life. So I drew a circle within their circle, and it comes out looking like a donut. The goal, leave no one in the hole falling short on the essentials of life, but don't overshoot Earth's limits. The goal, and therefore the shape of progress, is not endless growth, it's thriving. Can everybody just do that for a moment? Just do that with your hands. Just feel it. It's just like a heart. Oh, you look lovely. It's like a heartbeat, right? This is the shape of progress. So different from that thrust of growth. Can we learn to do that? Can we learn to teach economics like that? Because right now, we are massively out of balance. This is the world. Billions of people falling short on life's essentials, overshooting at least 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries. For me, this is like the first diagram that every economics course should be. Welcome to economics, not here's supply and demand. Welcome to economics. Here is the challenge. Here's where we are. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do with markets, with the state, with the commons? How are we going to create incentives, institutions? How are we going to use the tool of economics to turn this story around? Because that surely is the ultimate test of whether or not we are good economists, of whether or not this degree is worth anything, of whether or not we have equipped you to be the students who go out and become the leaders and the policymakers and the business leaders and the journalists and the judges and the decision makers and the activists of the 21st century. Isn't that the job of a university? Are today's students being equipped for this? Not yet. Here are some national donuts, right? Because every country has very different responsibilities. Malawi, massive human shortfall without overshooting their share of planetary boundaries. China, double whammy challenge. The UK and the US, both high inequality. We're known for that. That's a nice reputation, isn't it? And massive ecological overshoot of the planet, as all high-income countries have. So massive differences between nations. Let me give you this scatter plot. The place where every country should want to be is that top left-hand corner. That is where you rise up to meet the needs of all people, but you come back within the means of the living world. So that's the sweet spot. Country that's closest, Costa Rica. There's the countries I just showed you, Malawi, China, UK, US on there. And let's just recognize that even though they're separated like little freestanding spots on a scatter plot, these countries are profoundly connected. And their stories are profoundly connected by histories, colonialism, right through to the current and future impacts of climate breakdown. So it's about the relations within and between that needs to change. So pursuing growth has generally taken us this direction. First towards, but then sailing straight past that corner. So growth as an economic goal is not going to take us into the donut. What if we could reorient? What if low-income nations could meet the needs of their people without overshooting planetary boundaries, as all before them have done? That's unprecedented. What if middle-income nations, instead of shooting straight past that spot, could orient themselves into it? And what if nations like this and all the rich countries that are in massive red throbbing overshoot could massively reduce their energy and material use and waste and through flow, while finally meeting the needs of all their people, because they certainly have the means to do it. And this will call for a huge rebalancing between nations. Call that reparations, call that restoring ownership of land, call that reconciliation, redistribution of wealth and power, rewriting of the rules of trade and finance. For me, this has now become my Uber map of progress for the 21st century. So whenever I listen to international negotiations or domestic politics or local politics, I ask myself, will that policy, will that action help take us towards this point or not? And if not, what are we doing? How can we begin to get there? We need to not focus on endless growth, but we need to change the deep dynamics of our economies. Two big ones, and for this I need to go physical. Okay, we've inherited linear, degenerative economies, the pipe of production, stick materials in one end, make it into stuff we want, and the pollution comes out the other end. That is what has been pushing us over planetary boundaries. We need to bend this linear, degenerative economic system into a circular, cyclical, regenerative one, where resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully, collectively, creatively, and slowly. How do we make that start? But at the same time, we have inherited economies that are deeply divisive through privilege, through inheritance, through regulation, through law, through the coding of capital. They capture value and opportunity in the hands of a few, and we see the rise of a 1%. Now, locally, nationally, globally, supercharged by COVID. We have no chance of getting into the donut in such an extraordinarily unequal world. We have to become distributive by design, sharing value and opportunity far more equitably with everybody who co-creates it, and that turns out to be the whole of society. So what would it mean to have a regenerative, distributive economy, and how could we create that? What if we each imagined ourselves at this table and asked ourselves, how does the way that I eat, shop, travel, invest, divest, protest, vote, volunteer, how does all the ways that I live have an impact on whether or not humanity can thrive in this space? How do I make those changes? What if every company drew up its strategy around this table and says, well, let's admit that the way we've made profit till now has kind of been by driving humanity and the planet out. It's been very profitable, but now it's time to change the design of this company so that it becomes a vehicle for actually bringing us into this space. What kind of business could do that? What if all architects drew up their plans for buildings, for cities, for districts, with a donut on the design table, as some architects tell me they actually do? What if every government had a ministry for the future? And every year, the G20 brought together the ministers of the future around this donut-shaped table and said, here we are together to imagine and make this future happen. What if the UN Security Council met around the donut table? Okay, that's not actually the UN Security Council, but you get the point. That's Dr. Strangelove, if you're missing the reference for a moment. But really, and I started making, these are all Photoshop, ladies and gentlemen, don't want to be taken down for deception. These are Photoshop. But I started playing with Photoshop. What if, what if? And then, of course, wonderfully, along comes in 2015 Stan's book, Aurora. What if people, as the Earth was dying, had to travel for hundreds of years to find another planet that might be habitable? And they traveled in a donut-shaped spaceship. You can imagine I like this book. Could they take all they needed from ecosystems? Because there's not just one generation. They need to reproduce and live and survive. So they need an ecosystem in there with them. Artists began to draw artists' impressions of what it would be like to live in this incredible, inside this torus world with housing and food and education and health and wildlife, because those ecosystems need to work. Could you make that? Could you design an ecosystem, a miniature world inside a donut that could actually thrive? And in one of those wonderful ways in which life starts to imitate art, at the same time, people started writing to me on Twitter. This was a workshop held by some folks in Berlin. And they said, we are holding a workshop today asking, can Berlin live in the donut? Can we make this city a city that lives inside the donut, whatever that would mean? Lots of town councillors and mayors started getting in touch. We want to live in the donut here. We're not going to wait for the UN, for the national government. We're going to start it here, which is where all change happens, right? It's people with conviction just make things start happening. So at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we thought, let's make this a tool. Any town or place that wants to use this, here's a tool. So I invite you, think of a place that you know and love and you know well, whether it's this city or where you've lived before, where you were born. Imagine that place and ask, what would it take for them to live there in the donut? We unroll the donut and ask this little question, but it's actually obviously a very big question. How can this city become a home to thriving people in an ecologically thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Big question, big complex question. Nothing goes away if you ignore it, so we put it all in there. But let's break it down. We call these the 4 lenses. So 4 questions, local questions for local aspirations and big questions for recognizing that everywhere is connected to everywhere else. I mean, even just this room. Where did the clothes we're wearing, the electronics, the stage, the food we've eaten today, they've been brought from all over the world. So we depend for quality of life here on resource extraction and labor everywhere. So what would it mean for all of the people of our place to thrive? That's a local conversation, and this is actually the one that most cities spend most time talking about, but we have to look beyond that. What would it mean for this place to thrive like nature nearby? The ecosystems here go to Whiten Woods. That's the best healthy nature in this valley. Nature's sequestering carbon. She's housing wildlife. She's storing groundwater. She's cooling the air from the treetops to the forest floor. Can we create a city that does that? That's cool on a hot day instead of an urban heat island effect, that absorbs rainwater instead of has flash flooding? Can we be as smart as nature in the way we design our habitats that are nestled within nature? So these are the local aspirations, but we've got to put it in global context. How can this city respect the health of the whole planet and come back within those planetary boundaries? Everything we import here that's extracted, how do we reduce our impact in the world? And think of the people who stitch our clothes, who pick and pack our food, who assemble our phones. Are they paid living wages? We are connected to them through global supply chains, through trade rules, through migration rules, through immigration, through the culture and practice of migrant welcome. How are people welcomed when they come here in desperation? Who are we in relation to others? So these are the 4 lenses that we invite places to explore. And now over 80 local governments and cities around the world are asking themselves this question. They're all, I think of them as like making mini Aurora spaceships. Can we live in the donut here? And of course, the answer is no one can do it alone because everything is interconnected, but you can get started. Let me show you a couple of places that are getting started. Barcelona, really, really leading change in so many ways. They unrolled the donut, these 4 lenses, they gathered the data. How are we doing? They re-rolled it. There's their spaceship. They're in shortfall and overshoot, and they're admitting it. I mean, that's half the battle won already. They're actually admitting it. We are out. And now we're going to track our progress through to 2050 as to whether we can actually come back into that space and thrive through transforming our city, through transforming the culture and the way we govern. Cornwall turned the donut into a decision-making wheel. So instead of doing a cost-benefit analysis on everything, put it, infrastructural projects. Does it improve people's lives here? Does it improve the ecological health of this place? If not, how do we redesign it to make it do that? Can we go from now towards 2050, and how are we doing? Right? You can see the green is getting better, the red's getting worse. This traffic light multi-dashboard is so much richer in telling you how Cornwall is doing than me saying, oh, Cornwall's GDP grew by 1.3% last year. I mean, so what? Were they cleaning up an oil spill? Were people getting divorced? Or were they investing in health and education? It matters what the money's spent on. And this actually takes us to human and natural metrics. It takes us close to what we really care about. Thimphu in Bhutan. The government of Bhutan got in touch and said, we have our philosophy of gross national happiness. And of everything we've heard coming out of Western economics, the donut sounds like it makes sense. So we want to put them together. We want to use both concepts in reimagining, and here's their fiction in cartoon. Here's imagining well-being, a thriving Thimphu in 2047. How can we tell ourselves new fictions that actually take us where we want to go? Much closer to home, a few cities away, amazing organization called Civic Square in Ladywood in Birmingham, doing this work at the scale of a tiny neighborhood, Can we retrofit one street at the time? Can we involve everybody who's always thought economics was a really intimidating thing of equations? It's not. It's about your life. And we're all involved in that economic conversation. They're opening it up to people who would never otherwise have seen themselves as part of that. It is political economy, and everybody has a life in the politic. So let me come back and finish by recognizing that although I'm advocating the donut as one possible compass for progress, I also want to recognize that all ideas are ideas of their time and their moment, and I'm also encouraging the donut to keep evolving, as it will and should. Fictions have a moment in time, and then we need new fictions. So here's something I notice about this concept. It places humanity at the center, because we care desperately about human rights. Can we make sure that all people meet their rights and their needs? There's massive deprivation in the world right now, so there's huge reason to do that. But if you look around all these 9 planetary boundaries, one of them is very, very different from all the others. And it's this one. And we've called it biodiversity loss. You could reframe that as all other living beings. All other living beings are here on the edge. If we treat them, again, in this language, in this framing, they were to say, well, thank you, goodbye, you've lost us. Is this really how we want to see ourselves? Let's look after humanity. Let's just not lose too much. Let's save a few, not lose too much biodiversity here. So what if we were to take this concept and go really biocentric and invite all these living species in, open this up as a doorway into the center and say, welcome, let's be in here together. For me, then, this becomes a fascinating question, and I keep voicing it in the hope that a student says, that's my master's dissertation, that's going to be my PhD. What would be the principles, the values that we could invoke? Animal rights, the rights of nature, the honorable harvest, half of the earth. What else? How could we even begin to talk about what that means for all living beings to thrive within these incredible cycles of this earth that makes her the only known habitable place for life in the universe? That, for me, is the question that I would love to see both economic fictions and non-fiction and fictional novelists taking forward. That is the conversation we need in this Parliament of Species. What if those G20 ministers, and if the Ministry for the Future has non-human members, who will they be? And how will we listen to them? I think we might hear some more about that this afternoon, of how we can listen to other species. So let me finish with the journey we are on, always still on and never arriving. 1966, before I and many of us were born, it was the cowboy economy, recognized already for its exploitative ways. This is the economy of endless growth, which still dominates our politics. We've been begged for over 50 years to move towards a spaceman economy. In economics, in fiction, can we recognize we are in a delicately balanced enclosed space and learn to live like we valued these incredible resources that aren't replaceable and aren't going to be renewable if we run them down? But actually, that really isn't who we are. We're not floating in a technological space. We are deeply embedded in the web of life. So maybe this is the new metaphor we must now embrace, the web of life, and how do we bring economics as part of a web? It's about interconnection. It is about complexity. It's about recognizing that we don't understand how the most of it works yet. So how do you work in a space of, there are not levers. Keir Starmer said on Monday, I think when we get into power, the first lever we're going to pull is the growth lever. Where is that? And is that really what you want? Can we pull the life lever? Can we pull the thriving lever? That will be a lever worth voting for. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. I think you sometimes jokingly say the donut is the only donut that is actually good for us. It certainly is becoming a tool to visualize progress. And I was very impressed by your ability to show us that it's actually one of the greatest accounting tool ever invented. It's an accounting tool that can immediately be picked up by people. It's intuitive. People can use it individually. They started to use it as little governments, bigger governments, cities, and so on. So the question is, when are corporations, when are policy decision makers who are deciding about our lives going to use it as well, as we are building a new sustainable political economy? So on that note, I'm going to ask Stan to join here us on the podium. Oh. Stan, please come and join us. It's all going.
Will it work?
Yeah.
Will that work? Am I
Exactly.
audible?
So
Perfect.
Stan, when you wrote Ministry for the Future, you probably didn't know that it's going to go down as one of the greatest fictions written about economics.
That's true. I did not know that.
So, and I very much think that the donut thinking underlines it. That is the reason why Kate spoke first. And so now over to you. Let's hear about this sustainable political economy and how do we get there?
Thank you, Annette. And thank you, Kate. Thank you, Annette Mikes and Tom Fletcher and Steve New and everybody at Hartford College. It's been a remarkable 3.5 years since Ministry for the Future was first published. And I've learned a lot in that time, but I have to say this is a particularly unusual and special moment for me. I have a lot of other helpers here in the crowd who have made these last 3.5 years in education, including Nigel Topping and my good friend Jeff Ryman, and there's others I want to mention, but it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm interested to try to talk, and I want to do this as kind of a gloss on what Kate just told you, and bring up another concept that it comes out of the planetary boundaries model of Johann Rockstrom, that we are in a polycrisis century. This is a century of multiple and interlocking crises that put us close to what you could call tipping points. We hear this term tipping points, but I think it's a little bit anodyne of a term, and it reminds me of things that I was a dedicated reader of British climbing literature when I was young, not being a climber myself, but an avid armchair climber, and there was always this exposure. There was this talk of exposure. There was some exposure there, and on we went, et cetera. And so I was about halfway up the Matterhorn tied to a guide, thank God, and I suddenly understood this exposure. Well, it was exposure to death. And with British understatement, they had left that part of it out. It was just exposure. You didn't have to speak of the rest of it. It's a stiff upper lip time. But at that point, I quit climbing, especially, at least after I got down, and never did it again, because exposure to death isn't that fun if you are aware that you would like to continue to live. And so tipping point, what are we talking about there, and how close are we to it? The tipping point is into catastrophe, and I want to not speak about apocalypse. I want to talk about catastrophe. We're not talking about the extinction of the human race. It's not apocalypse. It's not the end. It's a mass extinction event. It's an end for thousands of these other beautiful species that we coexist on this earth with, and our health is all interpenetrated with them. Many of them would go extinct, and the catastrophe for human civilization would be quite severe. Let's put it that way in its appropriate context. And it could lead, in fact, to hothouse Earth. So that, in other words, if the tipping point is passed where we begin to release more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, then that creates a runaway heating effect. And hothouse Earth has existed. The paleoclimatologists have taught us that. There have been moments in the Earth's past where there was no ice on this planet. And at that point, sea level is approximately 270 feet higher than it is now. We might be underwater here, I wouldn't know. But we have a situation where it's because more CO2 has been released into the atmosphere faster than ever before in geological time, except for the occasional asteroid strike. We are a kind of asteroid, and in the last couple hundred years, we've done things that geology per se never did. And we do not want to lose control of the Earth's systems. Not that we have control, but what I'm meaning to suggest here is we don't want a runaway to begin, that even if all humans at that point decided, okay, we do have to take this seriously, we do have to counteract it, now we will respond, now we will claw back, you wouldn't be able to anyway. We don't have that much physical power. And so that's the danger. That's the planetary boundary, the outer boundary that Rockstrom and Stefan and et al. In 2009 in a very famous Nature paper, re-upped a couple years ago, renewed for the public in a new paper by the same crowd. This is not a negotiable boundary. This isn't something that you can say, well, that's all very well, but I need to do what I'm doing right now. And actually, we aren't clever enough or fast enough. There's too much path dependency. There's too much accumulated capital. There's too much inertia in our brains. We can't deal with this. So since we can't deal with this, we won't deal with this. But we have to deal with this because these planetary boundaries are serious business for the generations to come and for all the other species on Earth. So in that context, I wrote Ministry for the Future, and it's a question now, quite active. What could a Ministry for the Future do? Kind of an extremely active question for us working on this project here at Harvard College. I am an English major, and so I want to say that the preposition was actually carefully chosen. It's Ministry for the Future, not of the future. And people make that mistake all the time, as if it doesn't make any difference, because often prepositions don't seem to make any difference, and people learning English as a second language are often mystified at the specificity of our usages of prepositions. But for means for. It's a ministry for the future. So what is the future? We never get there. It's always in the future. It's always an idea in the present. So then you begin to think, well, there is actions we can take in the present. We're always in the present. What shall we do here? So the ministry is, it's never here. It's a strange concept, the future. But what I'd like to suggest is a thought system out of the wonderful English literary critic Raymond Williams, there's a couple incredibly useful concepts out of Williams. One of them is the structure of feeling, that at any given moment of time, a civilization has a structure of feeling that is a norm, a hegemonic set of, although we have natural biological emotions, they are structured by language and by culture into certain patterns that we think of as natural that are actually culturally constructed, and that structure of feeling keeps changing over time. So think of ourselves as being in, at this point, a neoliberal structure of feeling, the 1980 to 2020, or capitalist realism, a very useful phrase for suggesting that what we think of as real is actually a structure of feeling that we've concocted, that we live within, that can change and now needs to change. And the structure of feeling is useful to think of. We need a new one. In fact, since the old one died in 2020, you could say that we're in an interregnum. As Gramsci talks about this, the old order has died, the new order has not been invented. In between, you're in the interregnum. It's confusing. It has a feeling of dread and uncertainty in it. And then the other Williams idea that I want to invoke right here is residual and emergent, that at any given moment in history, you have things that are residual from the past, including the deep past, our evolutionary past as primates and as Paleolithic people. Then also there are emergent factors that are coming into the world that will, some of them will eventuate and become more prominent. Some of them may die away in some kind of embryonic state. But there is, in every moment in history, the residual and the emergent. In the present, you're living in that with aspects of both. I want to point out that it's not a good-bad division of things. It's not that residual is always good or always bad, nor is what is emerging always good or always bad. That's not the way to make the cut. It's just that some things are residual from the past and may go away. I mean, did feudalism ever go away? Well, think about capitalism as being The residual is feudalism. Is there still royalty and aristocracy, a management class of squires, and a whole lot of peasants and serfs? Oh my God, maybe we still are in a kind of liquid feudalism. On the other hand, what's emergent? Well, we're in capitalism, so that's the moment that we're in. What's emerging that it will go towards? We don't know, but you can look around and you can see that what can't go on won't go on because we are in intense danger of wrecking the biosphere, and we can't go on the way we are. Something else is going to happen. What might it be? What's emerging, and what's emerging that is good and positive? And this, of course, is utopian science fiction. I've done it all my life. Science fiction is those stories that you set in the future to suggest where we might be going as a way of illuminating the present. And I want to mention that Oxford has seen several excellent science fiction writers convene even yesterday in order to honor a great fantasy writer, J.R.R. Tolkien. And we have one of the great living science fiction writers, Jeff Ryman, here in the front row, a good friend. It's a vibrant genre, a little small town with immense powers, because having chosen to set our stories in the future, we are taking on the somewhat questionable power of prophecy. So science fiction isn't exactly trying to predict the future. It's invoking possibilities in order to scare or inspire people. And I want to suggest that science fiction, I want you to understand what it is. It's like a pair of glasses that you wear in the movie theaters, in the 3D movies. Remember when there were 3D movies for about 5 years? One lens, the two lenses show you two different things. And science fiction is like that as a genre in its aesthetics. One lens is indeed trying to talk about a future that might come to pass. So it is actually about the future in a way that people often naively think it is. Not quite a prediction, but a trajectory or a modeling exercise or a scenario. The other one is simply a metaphor for the way things are right now. Always the case. Oh my God, there's a ministry of truth. Oh, I've turned into a robot. Oh, time seems to be speeding up. The literalization of these stories are metaphors for the way life feels now. Now, a sophisticated science fiction reader, and you kind of have to be a little sophisticated to have it be entertaining at all for you, manages to put the two images together, and as in a 3D movie or a stereopticon, a false 3D pops. And that third dimension, in this case a fourth dimension, is time. It's history. You read science fiction and you think, oh my God, I'm the past of, or the ancestor, as Roman would put it, of a future civilization that is going to look back and judge us. But in the meantime, I'm still active and an agent in the world, making one kind or the other. And the present itself is best understood as a moment in time that has both a past that you can read pretty well, although history is also a fiction. Looking at the past, we always interpret it. Looking at the future, we are making it up. And then we're always stuck in the now. So you have, indeed, in the science fiction story, in the utopian science fiction story, a hunt for things that are emergent now that might be drawn out. And this is what a ministry for the future could do. Look for what's emerging. See if any of it looks like it could help us. Also, be on guard for any thing emerging that might harm us, and act accordingly. Try to help and draw out and nurture emergent goodness, features of the present that are changing, because we certainly are in a moment of rapid change. That's the structure of feeling in our time, is that every 5 years, everything feels completely differently. What can we pull out? And this is something that a ministry for the future might be able to do, a kind of collection of examples, a kind of sorting mechanism, a kind of a collection of exemplary situations. And here, I just want to reaffirm the importance of Kate's circular diagram as opposed to the XY axis graph that we are also used to. Just for a moment, contemplate, many of us are not economists or scientific people here, I would bet, and like which is the x-axis and which is the y? Did you know that the scientific people actually call one always the same and the other? My wife explained that to me late in our marriage. I was quite astonished. But it doesn't really matter. And if I asked the non-quantitative people to tell me which was the X and which is the Y, we would get about 50% success rate, because it's a 50% chance you're going to be right, because you don't know, do you? You have no idea which is the X and which is the Y, if you're like me. And it doesn't really matter, but the vertical is very often messed up with. It's been manipulated. It could be logarithmic. So every 16th of an inch as you go higher, you're actually adding like 1,000 times more than you did before. And what looks to be rather comprehensible and straightforward is actually a logarithmic scale. And then the horizontal one, whichever one it is, I'll figure that out later. The horizontal one is very often time and goes to the years, and somewhere midway along is now, and damned if the rest of the graph, headed off to the right side, is the future. In other words, a science fiction story. So, perfectly respectable XY graphs are science fiction stories, and very often bad science fiction, poorly done, weakly done, in that you'll look at the part of the graph, and when it goes into the future, straight line extrapolation. Does that ever happen? No, but what else are you going to do with your graph? You straight line extrapolation. What if you have a curve that's going upward at a sharp way, the famous hockey stick graph? Well, that curve is going to shoot right up to infinity. So you look at the population graph and you realize that in about 15 to 20 years, we're going to have about 40 billion people on this planet, because it's following the curve. How could it not be? Well, of course, that doesn't happen. The curve is basically the logistical curve, the S curve. Things gather their resources, they begin to shoot up an angle. At that point, you say, oh my God, it's Moore's Law. Every 18 months, things are going to double. Ignoring the old story of the Asian potentate who was fooled by a peasant who said he would take twice as many rice grains on each square of a chessboard, and then the potentate said, fine, no problem, and began to do it, and then realized he had to execute his vizier and the peasant and everybody else because it's too many rice grains. You cannot extrapolate into the future. There is no Moore's Law. You run out of resources. It's often an S curve, but when does it begin to curve off? How long does it go before it runs out of resources? Depends. Are you talking about lithium, or are you talking about average lifetimes? In each case, it's an unknown. And so then when you use these graphs to predict the future and confidently say, well, the population's going to be this, or the stock results are going to be that, so you can invest right away, it's always a science fiction story that's being promulgated without the honesty of science fiction, which just says, pay me $10 and I will tell you a story. And you can make of it what you want. So these are things that can be done by a ministry for the future. Draw on things in the present that could be encouraged in the future. Another thing that could be done is legal standing for animals and for the biosphere. And this is hard, because legal standing is a catch-22. You can't get legal standing until you have the legal standing to claim legal standing. So how does it go? Where does it start? It is a catch-22. You can't have it till you have it. So it works by precedent. It works by case law. Along the way, you have to push at the edges, and you get it one little moment at a time. Sometimes you have to just strike out with an axiom, like in geometry, or a fiat decision, like in Ecuador's constitution, which says that the forest is a citizen, or the New Zealand law that now claims that certain rivers and mountains are citizens in the body politic and therefore deserve a lawyer just like anybody else. These are significant moments because that kind of precedent can be extended to the next case along the way. And these are a kind of Bruno Latour actor network. We're in an actor network that includes the biosphere as parts of our body. 50% of the DNA in your body is not human DNA, and this should be very educational factoid to go on to consider the rest of the biosphere as part of our body. And this limited agency that the other actors have is nevertheless real agency, because everything alive is trying to live, and they sometimes may eat you, they sometimes may help you. Legal standing, we might have in the audience here a very interesting question of legal standing that has to do with not just animals in the biosphere, but the people of the future. So in a ministry for the future, you need to be paying attention to any opportunity to assert that the people of the future, who do not yet exist, our great-great-grandchildren, who are yet to be born and yet will be as real as us, presumably even in this very hall, at some time in the future, that they too have legal standing now. Quite interesting. So it could be recently a group of 8 women from Extinction Rebellion, and some of them may be here today, which would be fantastic. In fact, maybe so. Broke some windows in banks in order to protest the banks investing in fossil fuels, because that was going to harm the people of the future, and they were therefore arrested. And Claire Farrell, I think, is here. And they were arrested at very severe accusations of property damage that could have had them in jail. And their defense was, we had to do it. And I know this is, I don't mean to make fun of it, but I'm trying to imagine the courtroom, and the judge says, why did you break these windows? Well, we had to do it. Why did you have to do it? And he's probably thinking, well, we didn't want to hurt anybody else. We were drunk at the time, and we had to do it in order not to, kill the people we were fighting with. No, we had to do it because that bank is killing the future people, and we needed to bring some symbolic action against them to get attention to that. And here's the kicker. We were doing the same thing that women did 100 years previously, breaking windows in banks in order to get the vote and get the attention and get the vote. Precedents. In law, that's very important. So a 100-year-old precedent was suddenly brought forward into the present, and it goes further than that. 100 years ago they did it, and now we are perfectly convinced they were right. So now in the present, we must be right. And not only that, but I am representing in this moment the person that I will be 100 years from now. And the judge probably says, well, that means that 100 years from now, you'll be 130 years old. And the defendants could say, well, medical advances are going very quickly. I will be 130 years old then. And I'm speaking for that person now in my actions, and I did this because of an overriding consideration of defending future people that aren't here now to do their own thing. What's interesting is the jury said, yeah, not guilty. They had to do it. Well, this was world historical. This was a massive precedence and a great victory for the whole team. And it's a kind of a cheeky defense, really. I broke these windows because I had to, because of an overriding consideration of a historical contingency. This is activism. This is really taking a next step in a kind of ministry for the future. And I began to think about these century gaps when I was pondering this talk. I was an activist when I was 50 years ago. A young man protesting the Vietnam War, did not want to go there and be involved in war protests. And we actually did lie down on Highway 5 when Nixon bombed Cambodia. And I could go on with this story, but it's irrelevant, except for this. If in 1970, when I was 20 and an undergraduate, somebody on stage, an old person, had begun to talk to me about what had happened 50 years before, they would have been talking about the end of World War I. And this is the kind of time travelers we are. Even though we only time travel at a rate of 60 minutes per hour, enough time passes, and I am speaking to you from 1970, but if somebody had been speaking to me in 1970, they would have been speaking to me from 1920, and then, damn, at the protests when Nixon bombed Cambodia at my school, speaking to us was Herbert Marcuse, who was indeed 70 years old and talking to us about 1920 in Germany after World War I. Not that I paid any attention at the time, nor did I think to myself, oh, in the year 2024, I will be 72 years old, and I really wonder what that'll be like. No, it's not really on your radar to think like that. We don't think in 50-year chunks or 100-year chunks. And yet, all of us are still alive in the same room together as contemporaries. You don't want to get into this kind of generational game of every 10 years being totally different. No, we're all here, alive together, working on this moment. And in 100 years, it'll be the same. That kind of long-term thinking, I think, is really important. So I want to kind of draw things to a conclusion here because we had this great Tolkien event here yesterday, because we're talking about a science fictional ministry, ministry for the future. Young people have started to read fantasy instead of science fiction. It's a heartbreaker for those of us who've seen the flip in the genre. And I'm thinking about fantasy literature. It'd be so nice if magic worked. It'd be so nice if the villains looked like the ogres on the walls around this town and could be identified by wearing black all the time. And it'd be so nice if you could just take a big sword that was quite magical and cut their heads off, and evil would be done with and you would win. It's a very comforting story, magic and fantasy. But it's also, I think, I don't want to make fun particularly of Tolkien because it's allegory. There are dark forces. There are little tiny people who have to go out and do things. So there is a fair bit of truth to this allegory in Tolkien of the constant fight of little ordinary people from the Backshires having to go up against quite bad forces who might actually look just like everybody else, but they're also at the same time Sauron and Saruman. So I'm not going to say, although I want to add, I just saw Ian McKellen play Falstaff in London a couple nights ago. Awesome, I recommend it. But you know, he also played Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, and so it was very funny to be watching him on stage thinking, you know what? Gandalf was a bullshitter too. At every point, Gandalf would say, oh, sorry, I have to go off to another universe. There's some pressing business. You fight on, and when you've defeated everybody, or at the last moment, I'll come in and sweep up for you. And so right when they need Gandalf, he's gone. There's a great new article on ChatGPT, not as having hallucinations, but having a problem with bullshit. So it's an important distinction, and the article, you have to look it up. I think if you Google ChatGPT and bullshit, it will come up. A recent article making the sociological definition of bullshit as a deliberate thing rather than an accidental hallucination. And it's funny to think of Gandalf as Falstaff, and there might be some truth to it. And what you really need, I think, though, is the basic truth of that fantasy story of little people going out there and by stubborn persistence throwing themselves into the battle. It's never a pure situation. They use mixed methods. They have to even get violent in their own self-defense. It's a crazed situation, and you have to hold your head together and find your allies, which are cross-species allies. It's really a mixed group of species that gather in the Fellowship of the Ring, I think, has at least 3 or 4 different species of humans and semi-humans, etc. Well, that's just what it's like now for us. So there's some deep truth there, even though I would speak for science fiction over fantasy anytime I'm pressed on it. Let's hold to all the truth of the stories. And now, to end, Oxford Ministry for the Future. Universities, they are pre-capitalist in their origins. You create knowledge, you spread knowledge, you teach the young knowledge. They have a purpose in this world that is supposedly nonprofit and special. They're interesting. And, you know, a city on a hill, a light. Light can be incandescent. Light is also, in its physical state, incoherent. And so, and Oxford looks pretty incoherent to me in terms of its light. A very bright light, but not laser light. And what I want to say is that at a certain time, with certain machineries and methods, you can organize light into the waves are all beamed together, and they do things. They cut, they illuminate. If I had my laser pointer, I would, you know, blind a few people with it. The green ones are very dangerous, and you could see this was just ordinary light, and it was just a very small machine with a little power, an incredible result. And what I'm thinking is, out of the incandescence of ordinary light that might be Oxford University, there might occasionally be squished in these little laser beams of effectivity, doing things to try to help out. So it might be as small as really the pointer that I should have brought with me, but it may be that it could be useful nevertheless to have an Oxford ministry for the future. And for sure, it's going to make me feel a lot better. So it has that value. So thank you very much to everybody.
Okay, thank you so much, Stan and Kate again, for presenting us with two great talks stemming from moral imagination. And this is now to us, academics, who convert this, who change this into action, into research, into a pragmatic vision. So what we're going to do next, I'm going to invite a panel of academics who are emerging as the Oxford Ministry for the Future. The common factor is that we are all working on climate change, climate action. We're coming from various disciplines, but many of us are from the humanities. And with that, I would like to welcome also not just academics who are working here, but also scholars who had studied here and carry on working outside this university, such as our alumna writer, Lalin Paul. So I would like to invite Lalin, Mette, Jamie, Ben, and Venus. Please come and take your seat on this panel. Thank you. And I have to say, the Oxford Ministry for the Future is a growing network of scholars. So every time an email goes out, there is a longer and longer mail list attached. I would first like to ask Venus to lead the conversation. Venus captured my imagination when in a conversation she told me, you know, Annette, you can denormalize just about anything by historicizing it. And so she can, because she's a historian, an environmental historian whom we are very lucky to have here in Oxford. She joined this summer, so it's probably your first big plenary in the Sheldonian Library. So Venus Beaver, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Annette. Oh, yes, I've also never been mic'd before. I'm a loud Canadian. So as an historian, I love to teach my students about the relatively recent origins of seemingly intractable phenomena. So for instance, in my classes on food systems, I like to tell them that the current system that harms our bodies and poisons the planet is really just about 100 years old. And this usually gives them a lot of hope, right? Because if a problem is relatively new, it's much easier to imagine how we might build an alternative. And in a lot of ways, this is what I love most about being an historian. As Annette said, one of my favorite lines is that we can denormalize just about anything by historicizing it. And so this is an approach that I've taken to my work on the history of economic growth as well, and the various metrics that have been designed to measure it. So for instance, in the 17th century, British settler colonialism expanded into Ireland, and the Crown thought it would be a really good idea to conduct an extensive survey of Ireland's riches. And this led to really the first attempt at national income accounting. And then in the 20th century, 2 world wars and a Great Depression persuaded governments that having a more detailed picture of the economy would help them make better decisions. And so we ended up with GDP. But there's nothing natural or even obviously useful about GDP. We could use any other set of metrics, like Kate Raworth's Doughnut, which is infinitely more useful for building a planet that we might all want to live on. Oh, you go off script and then you forget where you are. Right. But figuring out how to measure things differently is really just one aspect of the problem that we're facing. And so, of course, the environmental crisis is really a crisis of inequality and extractivist logic. And when it comes to those two phenomena, my job as an historian gets a lot harder, right? The history of GDP and national income accounting, relatively short, discrete, easy to tell. The history of inequality and rampant natural resource extraction, much harder to contain into a neat narrative. Both have been with us since the beginning of human history, from Mesopotamia to contemporary Britain. And so this gets me to my first question. Oh, I forgot my original slide. Take a moment to appreciate the funny cartoon. All right. So my first question is, how do we historicize inequality and reckless natural resource extraction, given how pervasive they are in the present moment and how often they have dominated the historical record? And now on to the second point I want to make today. And the point is that the humanities are key in addressing the climate crisis. Governments currently tend to make choices that are based on imaginary models dreamed up by economists instead of on actually lived experiences that have been recorded by qualitative researchers. The journal Nature recently composed a list of the top 10 most cited publications in policy briefs. And the first 8 are all orthodox economics. I'll give a shout out to the heterodox economist on the list, Elinor Ostrom, for her work on governing the commons. But of course, this is what people are reading when they make really important choices about how to run the world. My problem with the list is that quantification tends to depoliticize what is really a political problem. And I'm not advocating that we dispense with models or quantification completely. Models are the reason that we know the global warming is real. So the trick is to come up with the right balance between science and justice, right? Between quantification and morality or ethics. And so that gets me to my second question. How do we combat the primacy of the model? And how do we repoliticize planetary destruction in a way that doesn't devolve into a bipartisan standoff? Because the environmental crisis that we are facing must be addressed head-on as a political problem, right? It is the end result of a series of power relations that are overlapping, from the power that producers hold over consumers to the power that very wealthy countries hold over the poorest countries. And so what do we do? How do we move forward? I want to propose my own list of what those in government should be reading. For reasons of time, I'm only going to talk about 3 titles. I have a full list of 10. If anybody wants it, you can email me, and I'm happy to share it. So the first item on the list is an article by the indigenous sociologist Vanessa Watts. And here she compares the European worldview with the worldview of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. And in doing so, she offers us an alternative to our European worldview in which humans enjoy a place in a hierarchy above plants and animals. In a worldview that instead places humans in relationship to all of the living things on the earth, it's simply not possible to engage in exploitative extraction. When all of the elements of the earth system have personhood, they have to be treated with dignity. The second item on the list is a book by the historian Julie Livingston, who explores the consequences of economic growth in post-colonial Botswana. And in doing so, she reframes our understanding of the Anthropocene by decentering a narrative we all know very well at this point about capitalism and the West, and instead she foregrounds what growth looks like in a developmental post-colonial context by looking in the global South. She opens her book with the traditional rainmaking ritual, and she's very clear that she's not advocating for a return to the past, which it was marred by its own systems of power, but instead she wants to give us an example of what a community can look like when everybody is brought together to call on the rain, right? So every person that is reliant on the rain for survival comes together in community. And she contrasts that world with the one that was made by post-colonial development, in which economic growth led the Tswana to pursue private riches at the expense of public wealth. She's also careful to say that economic growth is necessary for improving living standards for people in the global South, but that self-devouring growth undermines the body politic because it increases the gap between rich and poor. She ends the book by challenging her readers to think about how we might create new rituals that can bind all living beings together in what she calls collective self-agreement. The third item on my list is Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse, which is a retelling of the last 400 years of global history that demonstrates how the European world order that grew out of early modern imperialism is just as reliant on ecological exploitation as it is on the subjugation of colonized peoples. From the 16th century conquest of the Bandanese in Southeast Asia to contemporary Black Lives Matter protests, he wants us to think about the much longer history behind the contemporary environmental crisis. So what all three of these pieces have in common is an emphasis on the social and interdependent nature of humans. And this brings me to my third and final point. And I'm going to echo a lot of what Kate said. The rational, self-interested economic actor that Adam Smith first imagined in the 18th century and that has become taken for granted by the entire discipline of economics is an historical construct. And I would say that one of the most damaging effects of orthodox economics has been the widespread acceptance of a version of the human that is rooted in competition, driven to maximize self-interest by accumulating as many goods as possible. If policymakers take it for granted that humans are self-interested, competitive, maximizing monads, then they're going to build a world in which those traits are encouraged. The good news, right, is that if policymakers instead start to think about humans as cooperative, socially minded empaths, then they can begin to build a world that will encourage those traits instead. A world in which we are all bound by mutual responsibility, not just to each other, but also to the earth as well. And that's it. I had 8 minutes and I wanted to stick to time, so thank you.
Thank you, Venus. Next up is Laline Paul. Laline is not an academic. Laline is a writer. She is a novelist. She is a screenwriter and a playwright as well. She's the author of 3 books that changed my world: The Ice, The Bees, The Pod. The Bees were first written 2014. Yep, it has just been republished again as a vintage classic. The kind of person that Laline is, Laline takes a multi-species view and tells people good news, such as last year's best news, she told me in one conversation, was that the British Library has incorporated a collection of recordings of whale song in its Indigenous Peoples section. So this is the kind of person that Laline is. She points to information that suggests to us that there are voices out there that are worth listening to and that we ought to listen to. So over to you, Laline.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah, it is. Thank you, Annette and Steve and Hartford for inviting me, and Kate and Stan, if I may, for books that have really expanded my mind, and your patience if I echo things that you've already heard. And also thanks, Annette, for taking a paragraph of my speech. So, we're used to living in a zero-sum world with zero-sum stories, with extreme winners and countless losers, and panicking populations saved by a ruthless hero or heroes. And we really are sick to death of those stories. So we need ones that don't insult our intelligence or our hearts, and it's the job of the artist and the economist to do that. And in storytelling and in the news, perspective is everything. Whose story is it? Why tell it that way? And why tell it now? So I'm going to stay in my lane as an artist and tell you what I've been doing that I think is relevant to today. I've written 2 novels from non-human perspectives, one from a honeybee and the other a multi-species cetacean epic. And the third novel, which bridges them and which I think brought Annette and I first into contact, is set in the human world of Arctic conservation and Arctic exploitation. And the story turns on the breaking tension between them. It's called The Ice. It's set in Svalbard. And in the course of my research, I met charismatic and frequently frightening business people, somewhat like the man in Kate's diagram with nature at their feet and money in their hearts. And they were pretty shameless, claiming that they could do both at the same time, protect and exploit. And they talked big numbers, low emissions, and they drank a lot. And I did with them to get them to talk. And I also studied the long history of non-Indigenous Arctic explorers, who are usually men of a colonial, patriarchal mindset and skin color. But a few of them were also mental explorers, like Knud Rasmussen and Peter Freuchen. And they spoke the indigenous languages of Greenland and recorded everything of interest, including this window into shamanic cosmology, which a hunter told them, which I think is worth quoting. There is a power that we call Sila, a great spirit supporting the world and the weather and all life on earth. A spirit so mighty that his utterance to mankind is not through common words, but by storm and snow and rain and the fury of the sea, all the forces of nature that men fear. When all is well, Sila sends no message to mankind, but withdraws into his own endless nothingness, apart. So he remains as long as men do not abuse life, but act with reverence towards their daily food. No one has seen Sila. His place of being is a mystery in that he is at once among us and unspeakably far away. Well, we are seeing more of Sila all the time in incarnations of anger and warning. So the old ways are making new sense, not just emotionally, but also economically. Publishing is full of new nature writing. And like mycelium networks or the student protests against genocide, the legal defense of environmental rights is spreading all over the world. Stan already mentioned Ecuador. And in 2008, Bolivia also recognized the rights of nature, confronting the ongoing molestations of the extractive industries. And in accordance with indigenous Andean spirituality, Bolivia had no problem enshrining in law the natural world as Pachamama, or Mother Earth. In 2017, and you've heard this already, recognizing Maori spirituality, New Zealand granted legal personhood to the river Wanganui, and in that same year, India did it for the rivers Ganga and Yamuna. And in April of this year, tribal leaders from the Pacific nations conferred the legal status of personages on cetaceans, saying the sound of our ancestors' song has grown weaker and her habitat is under threat, which is why we must now act. And I think it's worth noting that these are all previously colonized countries that are the first to recognize the colonization of the Anthropocene on the biosphere. And it didn't make the news here, but in May of last year, as Annette mentioned, something extremely moving and important took place at the British Library when the Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust presented curator Cheryl Tipp with a rare recording of the West Coast community of orcas. And this population is now below the threshold of regeneration. So their living voices are joining those of other indigenous peoples, many of whom are extinct. But we don't want dead legends. We want and we need living wonders. And some of that is happening in the work of the Cetacean Translation Initiative, or SETI, which is based on the island of Dominica in the Caribbean. And here, a resident pod of sperm whales are being studied by an international team of scientists using AI and natural language processing experts as well, with the goal of learning to speak whale. And so far, the algorithms have identified that the whales have a phonetic alphabet with phrases and coders. And to me, it's no stretch at all to imagine an oral tradition and culture. And it's very plausible that the long-held dream of interspecies communication could happen in yours and my lifetime. And at Queen Mary College in London, Professor Lars Chitka is leading a team studying the mind, language, and possible culture of the honeybee, and has found fragments of communication that compare to verbs and nouns. 2 days ago, I don't know if anyone heard on Radio 4, Dr. Joyce Poole and her team in Kenya have announced a breakthrough in decoding elephant language, which is amazing. But when animal translation does arrive, we are going to have to confront the very frightening selfie in the attic about how we treat other species. Children who haven't had their compassion and sense of justice schooled out of them will be thrilled to talk to animals, but industrial livestock farmers won't be. And we don't want a bacon sandwich to have an origin story, but the truth is it already does. When I first heard the term natural capital, I was really indignant. I thought, you can't put a price on the natural world, but I think differently now. And thinking about the picture in the attic, Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, reminded me of the magical thinking that's involved in provenance in the art world that can push hammer prices into headlines. So a painting's provenance brings the security of investment not only because of the artist, but the line of important wealthy people that have held the art. And so just as a designer dress is just a garment, if it's worn by Princess Diana and photographed, it becomes a holy relic, and its price reflects that. So there is magical thinking, and there's an emotional imagination that creates real-world value and swings elections. And it should also be able to inspire a whole society to believe ourselves, as legitimate shareholders in global natural capital, with the expectation of real, lasting personal gain by looking after our shares. Do you know that slogan, you never actually own a Patek Philippe, you just look after it for the next generation? This is advertising legend, and it's still being used 20 years on because it works so well. And I thought, who made that? So I looked it up, and it's an agency called Legis Delaney. And this is the slogan they use as theirs. We redefine desire to provoke action. And as W.H. Auden is famous for doing, noting in margins, GETS, good enough to steal. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lillian. Next up, Professor Jamie Lorimer. Jamie is Professor of Environmental Geography here at Oxford University, and you share with Lillian the worldview, the perspective of a multi-species approach to what you do. Jamie has written books about conservation, and most recently about our ability and limits to our ability to control the planet. So, Jamie, over to you.
Great, many thanks. Thank you for the invitation. I want to pick up on one of the questions that Kate gave us about the fate of the non-human world in some of these emerging frameworks for environmental governance guided by Earth system science. And to do so, I just want to rehearse a very powerful story that underpins many of the accounts that Kate and Stan have given us around this idea of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is the claim that we've entered a new period of geological time because the human imprint on the global environment has become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth system. The Anthropocene comes out of Earth system science, a particularly powerful framework for understanding the Earth as a system of systems that are connected, in which we could imagine folding in humans and our activities as the technosphere. It presents the world as characterized by these planetary boundaries that give us the safe operating space for humanity that Kate talked about, or the donut that sits in the middle of this framework. And this is both a diagnostic tool. It tells us about how the Earth operates, but it's also a call for arms. It's a call for arms to be aware of the trajectories of the Earth system. So this is another powerful figure that comes from Will Steffen, who's one of the central figures in the Anthropocene debates about the Earth rolling towards us down this landscape, arriving at this planetary threshold, this tipping point, in which there is a call to invent forms of Earth system stewardship that would steer the Earth towards a stabilized future, to stay within planetary boundaries. And this has become a powerful imaginary for talking about geoengineering, for talking about technological solutions that would intervene into planetary boundaries, particularly the planetary boundaries around climate change, to keep us within a Holocene proximate future. But it also has powered up a different way of thinking about managing the planetary system that gets described as nature-based solutions. So a slightly more palatable, perhaps, version of thinking about the Earth as something that could be made subject to stewardship. And the idea of nature-based solutions is that you could identify ecosystem engineers, so very important ecological organisms that have the ability to intervene into the metabolic cycles that we're concerned about tipping over. So the most famous ones are trees, trees that could be planted to help fight climate change, to modulate the climate cycle. We hear this now in discussions about repurposing livestock as tools for sequestering carbon in the soil, that cows are not necessarily the enemy of climate change, that they can be part of the solution, or long-standing understandings about the nitrogen cycle and crop rotations, let's say. So I'm interested in the rise of nature-based solutions as a particular framework for thinking about planetary stewardship, but thinking about what that might mean for life if it gets reconfigured as a set of tools to save us from ourselves in different ways. And the organism that I'm most interested in is the beaver. So the beaver is, if you like, the archetypal ecosystem engineer. It's an organism that is particularly significant for modulating the dynamics of water systems. So we know of beaver because they cut through trees, but beaver cut through trees to build dams, to stabilize the flow of water in our landscapes, to create predator-proof spaces to reproduce. That's why they cut down trees, but in so doing, they can significantly change the flow of water through catchments. They can store water to prevent droughts. They can also store water to prevent flooding. And so recently, there's been a great enthusiasm in returning beaver, which have largely gone extinct from much of Europe and from parts of North America, as tools for restoring rivers, for preventing the sorts of damages that come from extreme weather events, either from extreme flooding or from extreme drought. So this is a diagram from the US Fish and Wildlife Service, tracing in a chronological set of figures what happens to a river when beavers come back. Many of you will know that beavers have returned to the UK, and they've returned in kind of interesting ways. So there's been an official set of introductions of beaver through sanctioned trials, but there's also been illegal releases of beaver into the landscape by beaver enthusiasts, in some ways calling the government's bluff. There's been lots of discussions about the need for beaver, but a lot of foot dragging. These beaver bombers, as they describe themselves, took beavers out into the landscape, let them go, and almost challenged DEFRA, the regulatory agency, to kill them. And DEFRA realized that a charismatic species like beaver would be quite hard to kill, and has subsequently regulated in favor of beaver, and we now have beaver back in the landscape. And we have a growing, elaborate set of ways of living with beaver, all sorts of techniques for catching beaver and moving them around, handbooks being produced to come up with management methods for living with beaver, various devices to allow landowners to modulate the flow of water through beaver dams to prevent some of the damage done by the catastrophic effects of a beaver dam burst. Okay, so there's a good news story, if you like, about beaver returning into landscapes, and in some cases, beaver are given great autonomy to shape landscapes and to flourish. But it's fair to say that the most prevalent way in which beaver are imagined as tools for hydrological engineering is as kind of ideal middle managers. You know, beavers turn up on time, they don't need to get paid, they kind of choreograph the work of other organisms in the ecosystem. They tend to be fenced into beaver labor camps kind of upstream. A beaver, given the choice, will live on the floodplain where living is easy, but if you want to slow the flow of water, you need to get beavers upstream. So beavers have been enrolled as ecosystem engineers, but their situation in the landscape is very much conditional on them doing work for us. So there's a kind of emerging functional environmental ethics in which some forms of life become valuable because they're tools for the job, but there's all sorts of things that might not figure in that calculus, and the beavers that don't work or won't work or pop up in the wrong places are quietly got rid of. Okay, so there's a version here of nature-based solutions which is green on the one hand, but has a certain quite instrumental idea of life at its core. At the same time, beaver are returning into landscapes that have not had beaver in them for a long time. They are turning into landscapes characterized by human infrastructure. They cause political tensions with landowners. There's an awful lot of unfamiliarity with beavers in the landscape that have to be worked through. And there's also a long history of these types of biological interventions going awry. So we can all think of examples in which hubristic ecologists have introduced a predator control a prey, and the predator doesn't like that prey but goes off and eats something else. This is an image from Tierra del Fuego, so down in the South America, which has never had beaver until quite recently. Beaver were introduced by the Canadian government as a development strategy to try and start fur trade in the 1940s. That never took off, but the beaver have spread and flourished and have caused these very weird kind of ecologically degenerated landscapes in parts of Tierra del Fuego. So this is a sort of caution here about the hubris that could come with some of these planetary scale visions for intervening into ecological cycles when we don't quite know what an ecosystem might become. Okay, so just to draw out some ideas that come from this and thinking about the futures of life in the Anthropocene governed through these nature-based solution frameworks, we get this very powerful way of imagining the Earth as a system of systems that has been pushed across thresholds. We can think about models of nature recovery that could sustain biodiversity, where you could reconcile the interests of life that is both human and non-human, keeping us within a donut that has a multi-species citizenship alongside people. But we should also think about what happens to the future of life if it becomes conditional on the work it does for us. If it remains anthropocentric, if it remains with that figure of the human at the top of the pyramid, there will be some forms of life that are held to be redundant. And there is a hubris at the heart of this that we need to be aware of as we think about executing these kind of visions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. So I understand you're calling us to think about what it is that we appreciate in conservation, what it means for us to have nature-based solutions. And taking that question to the corporate world, we have to call on the corporate world to also reevaluate what corporate social responsibility means and what CSR means, particularly in the context where we really need change to come from. And one of those contexts is the fossil fuel industry. So we are having Ben Frunter, Dr. Ben Frunter with us, whose research is on climate litigation. I think he created the field almost single-handedly. He's created a research center here at the Smith School for the Environment and Entrepreneurship. So Ben, come and share with us your wisdom on litigation and corporate social responsibility.
Thank you so much, Annette. And at this point, I think it would be great if we just took a moment to sort of re-energize ourselves. We've been sitting here for a while. So if I could use some of my time just for us to take some deep breaths, not to be cliche, but if you want to just sit here and take a deep breath, and just breathe in life. You know, this event is in service of life. It's what we're trying to do here. And breathe out whatever might be weighing you down. So for this next 7 minutes, I just want to tell 3 stories. And they all have to do with what we can do about climate change and the law in particular. I'm a lawyer, and this is sort of one of the tools that I think about in how we can address the problem. So the first story starts about 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, I don't think anybody saw it coming, but some journalists from Columbia University in New York were down in Texas in the archives. So these places that history students might be or things like that. They're in these archives, and they were in the archives of ExxonMobil. the big oil company. This is, one of the most powerful organizations in the history of capitalism. And in the archive, they found something that has rocked the world of law in the last 10 years, and I think was very shocking when they found it. And those were secret documents from Exxon. Secret documents from the 1970s, the 1980s, and they were all about climate change. Those documents were all about Exxon's understanding of climate change, what would happen, when it would happen, how it would happen, and what needed to be done to prevent catastrophe. And I use that word because that word appears in those documents. Globally catastrophic effects is one of the phrases in the documents. And so from about 10 years ago, we have known, and by we I mean the people who are interested in this sort of thing, and now you know it too, that Exxon and other big oil and gas companies understood everything there was to know about climate change at the time. And what is really shocking to me is that in these documents, they say there will be globally catastrophic impacts from climate change around our time now. And the way to prevent this is to replace fossil fuels as quickly as possible, starting right away. And this was in the 1980s. So many people didn't even know this was a problem until many decades later. I mean, I wasn't born then, but I didn't even know about climate change until, 10 or 15 years ago myself, living in a fog of ignorance. We all kind of live in that fog of ignorance. So that was a major discovery, and as a result, a whole swath of lawsuits were filed against the big oil companies, like the tobacco lawsuits. And you might know about the opioids lawsuits as well more recently. And now we have climate lawsuits against the big fossil fuel producers, trying to force those companies to pay for the damage caused by their products that they foresaw and that they covered up. Because historians will tell you there's a whole history of these companies denying the problem existed and then saying that they were working to fix it, and they weren't actually doing much to fix it at all. So those lawsuits, which are happening right now, in fact, they're worth hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars, and they're probably the most valuable lawsuits ever in the history of law by at least an order of magnitude, if not more. That's happening right now, and so we're in a very special moment. And this is a fun fact. That history that those companies knew and they lied about that is the most powerful climate messaging ever tested. Lots of things have been tested. Polar bears, save your children, save the planet. The most effective message, which is true, is they knew about this, and by they I mean these big fossil fuel companies, and they lied to the public about this. And both of those things are pretty hard to disprove now, given all of the documentary evidence. And that they knew and they lied, that fact motivates people to act on climate change more than any other fact. Even if people aren't sure if climate change is happening, they want justice when they hear that fact. And now you know that fact too. So that's happening right now. The next story I want to tell is, what do we do about this from a legal perspective? A few months ago, we were visited here by one of the Supreme Court justices from the state of Hawaii, who just retired. And one of the last things he did as a judge was to make the right to a stable climate a constitutional right in the state of Hawaii. Really revolutionary. And he came here to ask, what are we doing about climate change? And the question he posed to me was, what's your Manhattan Project on climate change? An interesting metaphor. And I said something like, well, we want to stop climate change. And he said, that's not a plan. And that's not good enough. Because we have 5 years to change the world in a very fundamental way. So what's your Manhattan Project plan for climate change? And so I went and I thought about it. And the first thing I did was to try to think of a different metaphor. And the best I could come up with was the Apollo mission. What's our Apollo mission for climate change? A mission in service of life and not in service of death. But if you have a better metaphor, I would love to hear it, because metaphors are how we think of our reality and decide what to do about it. But there are 3 things that we can do that would transform the world with the law, and all of them are happening right now. So I hope that you feel some excitement that things are happening. And the first is making the Paris Climate Agreement, which is this agreement to limit climate change as much as possible, essentially, to make that legally binding. Because that's sort of a voluntary agreement right now. It's not legally binding. But we can do that with the law, and that's what's happening right now with lawsuits across Europe and in international human rights courts around the world. The second thing we can do is make the companies that are causing the damage pay for the damage, and possibly make the governments in the countries causing the damage pay. Think about how that would transform the world. And that's happening right now, too, with these lawsuits I just mentioned. And the third thing we can do is this fog of obfuscation that we all live in, is the problem being solved or not? Are these companies really capturing carbon or not? What are they actually doing? We need to cut through that as well and have a very high standard of integrity for when we talk about climate change, that there isn't that deception and that greenwashing. And that can be done through the law too. So those are 3 things. That's my Apollo mission that's happening right now that at Oxford we're working on. And that's a work in progress. I say that not to tell you what to think, but to share that with you so that if you have ideas, we can be in this together. And then the last story, which is 30 seconds long, is the story of us right now in this room. This is an initiative that has a future that's not yet written. And we can write that together. And so we can bring our moral imaginations and our skills, our professional skills, and all of our skills together to do this together. So we will write this together. And that's the third story that you're part of too. So thank you. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And finally, we have Mette Morsing, Professor Mette Morsing with us. She's the director of the Smith School for the Environment and Entrepreneurship. Mette has joined us relatively recently from Scandinavia. She's a native of Denmark, and she worked at the Stockholm School of Economics before joining us. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that she's bringing a different perspective on the managerial world. She studies corporate social responsibility, and she understands that this is a story of the good, the bad, and the different. It's just very difficult for us to tell the difference between them. One story that she and I share with each other, if I ask in my undergrad classroom, economics and management classroom, my students, who are the key stakeholders of the corporation, they usually tell me immediately there are 3. There are the shareholders, the customers, and the employees. If you ask that question in a Scandinavian classroom, if Mette asked that question in Stockholm, the students would say shareholders, customers, employees, and society. So there is hope for us. Mette Morsing, over to you.
you so much. Thank you so much, Annette, for inviting me around here today. I'm very, very pleased to be here and very much in admiration of your courageous step here to have this crowd together and to take this leadership on this debate. And what I'm going to focus on here today is actually to take a look inside the organization. Inside the organization and to focus on the leadership in those organizations that govern, organize the products, our jobs, the exploitation of the world, but giving back in other terms of, for example, jobs and products, etc. So I want to take a look at the kind of leadership that defines success of these leaders and the kind of leadership. And just remind ourselves that that leadership actually invites every day 3.5 billion people on board. 3.5 people is the assessment of the number of people who go to work and who have an employment in the world. About 1/3 of them, 1.2 billion, work in larger or multinational companies. And the rest, the 2/3, work in small and medium size. Small and medium size meaning less than 250 employees. So it's 3.5 billion. It's a lot of people on a daily basis that are exposed to a particular leadership paradigm. And again, as has been said here before, of course, I run the risk of repeating what has already been said, but I think I might say it with other kinds of words. The kind of success that governs these organizations, and here I'm talking about public as well as private organizations, the kind of success is very much based on, Kate, what you also alluded to in your presentation, a lot, the homo economicus. The short-termism, the maximization of self-interest, the rational, rational human being who is not dependent on anyone and who actually controls the world. That kind of leadership is what we still also educate our students in our universities, in our management schools to be. This is the kind of success we bring in to become a leader and also to become a successful leader of organizations, private as well as public. There is another kind of success that you also alluded to, of course, Kate, in your presentation, which is the homo reciprocans, if we want to use the Latin word, or homo relational. This is the kind of human being for whom success is defined by relations, interconnectedness. It's defined by putting society first. It's defined by empathy and by being able to put yourself into the other's shoes. It might even be defined as looking upon all living beings with a kind of a personhood that we heard here from the panel before. So that kind of homo relational has another kind of perspective on time, which is a lot more long-term than the homo economicus. I'm not saying that the homo economicus is not necessary. I'm not saying that homo economicus should be deleted from the earth or from the way we think, but I think that there's another homo relational that we have simply forgotten, that we have simply suppressed, that is not a part of society that we take seriously and that we certainly need to surface as soon as possible in order to address the world's global challenges. The homo economicus, we usually say, well, we've learned from our friends in biology that it's very much inspired by a thinking about nature and survival of the fittest, a kind of Darwinist kind of thinking that permits that homo economicus. Well, some of our other friends in biology tells us another narrative that we can also use that more alludes to the homo relational. And that has to do with an experiment, a forest, small forest, putting some toxic fluidum at the fringe of the forest, assumption being that those trees who live at the fringe of the forest will immediately die. That doesn't happen because in the soil, the fungi, the mushrooms, if you like, the mushroom family, the fungi will transport the toxic fluidum and share it in the soil, share it amongst all the trees, so everybody gets a little bit, but nobody dies. That's a kind of sharing, another kind of learning from biology that I think counters and challenges the Darwinism that we are so used to teach and we're so used to bring into practice in our organizations, and that very much defined of success in leadership for organizations. So I think that there is an urgent need for the kind of leadership to bring in very practically into the world, you could say the world into the core strategy of an organization. And bringing the world into the core strategy of an organization, let's take an enterprise as a company, will take a completely different perspective on who is it actually we serve in our organization. Usually we will have as Annette said, we'll usually put a very high priority to the shareholder, the owners of the organization, and certainly our customers, and certainly our employees. But there's a completely different narrative to be told if the planet, if society is put first into the strategy. Could be interesting to see, and we will see that some companies are actually trying to do this, trying to experiment with doing this. We see what some has labeled CEO activism, where some CEOs of organizations are actually trying to readdress the narrative of what this company, what this organization is actually out there to do to serve the world. This will create another kind of resources, another kind of re-resourcing, another kind of accountability to whom is that organization then accountable. It will need to invite a lot of critique and a lot of accept of imperfection, a lot of invitation of dialogue that is usually not found time for in a daily organizational life. So I think that we can put some hope into the new, and I had this wonderful conversation yesterday with a group of chief sustainability officers here from this country. And that I really see those chief sustainability officers as a kind of an opening of the doors from many organizations, an opening of the doors for a new kind of dialogue, a new kind of narrative about what is the organization, what is the leadership in these organizations actually about. So you could sort of say, in an ideal world, they could maybe look upon themselves as sort of invited to reimagine or imagine new futures for the organization. The only challenge is that these currently many of these chief sustainability officers, they arrive in the organization with exactly that capacity, exactly that competence. They know what to do, they know how to change these organizations from the inside, and how to get the employees in the organization with them. Problem is, challenges that they are often found in what some of our research shows between a social and a commercial tension. They have to navigate the space of coming with the answers, coming with the ideas for how do we change this organization, and at the same time they're exposed to this short term. So you could say they sort of navigate in between the two homos that I've sort of depicted, the homo economicus and the homo reciprocans. They arrive with that energy, and they are not resourced enough to actually have that agency that they deserve and that the organizations they serve also deserve. So I have sort of decided to spend a little time of my research to look into more, how does that agency, how do they actually take agency also in the organizations, and some do that in very different ways that are really of big interest to us. So I will end my short note here, and Annette told me to end on an optimistic note. I tend to do the opposite, so she was nudging me a bit here. So I would love to end on an optimistic note, and I have to say, when I'm here at Oxford University and I'm looking upon our students, and before that, when I was working for the United Nations, looking upon universities and business school, more of 800 of them around the world, what I really have a lot of faith in is our students, is the young students of today and how they challenge us in the classrooms, how they put new demands, how they challenge, how they often know more than we do about the challenges, but also how to address them. So I think those future leaders that we have in the classrooms here with us, we need to listen to them. I think we need to rethink what education means. We need to remind ourselves about the extremely important role we have as educators of the world, that we actually, out of our higher education institutions around the world, give degrees to 220 million young students every year. 220 million young students, we give a degree each year. And by the way, 1/3 of them, 70 of them, come out of schools of business, law, economics, and management. Can you believe? These are also the leaders, not to say they are the only leaders of the world. We have all the other disciplines will certainly also deliver leaders. But just to say there's a huge responsibility for us to rethink the curriculum and to engage with the students and to sort of counter-argue for the results, or counter-prove the research that shows us many of these students, when they arrive in our institutions, they arrive with a pro-social behavior. When they leave our institutions 3 or 5 years later, that has changed to become a much more pro themselves and very much a narrower perspective on who are they for and what are they going to do in their work when they leave our institutions. So, youth, we have trust in you, but you, not just you as doing it for the future, but you in the classrooms challenging us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mette. So 2 hours ago, we started with a question: why is it that it's easier for many of us to imagine the end of the world than the end of this particular form of capitalism? And I think if we achieved our objectives here today, this is no longer the case. I hope we have managed to stimulate moral imagination in this room, whereby now you can imagine a better way of being, a better way of going forward. Of course, we still want to have what Gramsci called the pessimism of the intellect. We teach that to students, we teach that to our researchers, but we also have to pair that up with the optimism of the will. We want to spread hope in this space, and here I'm reminded by what our chaplain at Hartford College tells me about hope. Very simply, hope is a game, a collective sport. So the reason why we are here together is that we are engaging in that hope exercise, and we are also inviting the humanities as a very powerful and multifaceted voice that should be part of climate policy, climate action, and debate. So on that note, thank you for the forerunners of the Oxford Ministry for the Future for sharing their research and insights with us. Thank you also, Tom Fletcher, for figureheading Hartford College and hosting this for all of us. And thank you for the Hartford team, the events team, the development team that has pulled all of this together. And thank you, all of you, for being here, for your patience and time, and for engaging in this collective exercise of hope.